The year was 1954, and a restless wind swept across the gray-green waters of the Nieuwe Maas, carrying with it the scent of salt and the heavy industrial pulse of a recovering Rotterdam. In the boardroom of the Holland America Line, a daring ambition began to take shape, one that would challenge the very physics of the North Atlantic in the looming shadow of the jet age. The board sought to build a vessel that could serve as a bridge between two eras, a ship capable of grueling weekly shuttle runs to New York in the winter, and luxurious, leisurely world cruises in the summer. This dual-purpose destiny required more than just steel, it required a total reimagining of what a maritime silhouette should look like. The goal was to defy the traditional aesthetic of the great liners and create something so modern it felt as though it had arrived from a future where the sea was still king. To achieve this, the designers looked toward a profile that abandoned the soot-stained conventions of the past. The ship would be a massive displacement of nearly 39,000 tons, stretching over 700 feet in length with a beam of 94 feet. Unlike her predecessors, she would not feature a towering central funnel that bifurcated the sun decks with smoke and heat. Instead, the engineers proposed a radical aft-position machinery arrangement, venting exhaust through two slender, aerodynamic stovepipes. This technical gamble liberated the heart of the ship, allowing for a vast, uninterrupted flow of interior space that had never before been possible on a vessel of this magnitude. It was a masterpiece of Dutch naval architecture, balancing a sharp, clipper-like bow with a soft, cruiser stern that promised stability in the most punishing swells. The aesthetic of the new vessel was marketed as tomorrow's ship today, a slogan that captured the collective imagination of a nation still rebuilding from the scars of war. Willem H. de Montschie, the visionary chairman of Holland America Line, noted in a memorandum to the shareholders that the ship must not merely be a means of transport, but a floating ambassador of Dutch culture. He wrote, "Our new flagship must represent the very best of our artistry and our industry, proving to the world that the Dutch spirit remains as resilient and innovative as the tides themselves." This sentiment was echoed in the local press, where journalists described the construction as a symbol of the phoenix of Rotterdam rising from the ashes of its bombed-out docks to reclaim its status as a premier global port. As the keel was laid at the Rotterdamse Maatschappij, the air in the shipyard was thick with the smell of molten rivets and the rhythmic clang of heavy hammers against cold steel. Thousands of laborers moved like ants across the skeletal ribs of the hull, unaware that they were crafting the last great masterpiece of the Dutch merchant marine. There was a profound sense of nostalgia even in the birth of the ship, as if the workers knew they were building a monument to a world that the airplane was already beginning to dismantle. The atmosphere was one of quiet, professional pride, focused on the precise welding of the double-bottomed hull that would soon face the fury of the Atlantic. The stage was set for a legend to be born, but the technical risks were immense. The technical gamble of the SS Rotterdam lay hidden beneath her elegant waterline, within a hull designed to master the chaotic physics of the North Atlantic. Unlike traditional liners that placed their heavy machinery amidships to maintain a natural longitudinal balance, the Dutch engineers made the radical decision to shift the entire engine complex two-thirds toward the stern. This unconventional arrangement was a masterstroke of spatial efficiency, but it presented a daunting challenge for the naval architects at the Rotterdamse Maatschappij. They had to account for a dramatic shift in the ship's center of gravity, ensuring that the 38,000 tons of steel remained stable even when the fuel tanks were nearly empty or when 40-foot swells threatened to roll the vessel. The result was a hull of immense structural integrity, featuring a sophisticated system of internal bracing and a double-bottomed skin that acted as a silent guardian against the crushing pressure of the deep. Central to this engineering marvel was the removal of the traditional central funnel, a feature that had defined the silhouette of every great ocean liner for a century. In its place, the Rotterdam utilized two slender, twin exhaust pipes, often described as stovepipes, which were positioned aft of the bridge. This was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a functional innovation that solved the perennial problem of soot and hot gases descending upon the passengers on the upper promenade. By venting the exhaust through these thin, aerodynamic structures, the designers cleared the top decks for a vast, unobstructed sun area. Beneath the surface, the ship was powered by a set of Schutte-Parsons triple-expansion geared turbines, capable of generating 35,000 shaft horsepower. These engines were designed for whisper-quiet operation, utilizing double reduction gearing to ensure that the vibration usually associated with high-speed travel was virtually eliminated for those in the staterooms above. Technical notes from the shipyard archives reveal the meticulous precision required for this new configuration. One lead architect recorded in his journal that the placement of the boilers so far aft requires a symphony of ballast management. We are not just building a ship, but a finely tuned instrument of weight and counterweight. This engineering philosophy extended to the ship's stability systems, which included Denny Brown retractable fin stabilizers. These massive underwater wings could be extended from the hull to counteract the rolling motion of the sea, reducing a 20-degree roll to a mere 3 degrees in a matter of seconds. It was this combination of power and poise that earned her the reputation of being a steady ship, a vital quality for a vessel intended to carry the elderly and the affluent across the world's most temperamental oceans. The atmosphere in the engine room was a sharp contrast to the serene luxury of the lounges. Here, the air was thick with the scent of heated oil and the rhythmic, high-pitched whine of the turbine spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. Every valve and pressure gauge was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the Dutch obsession with cleanliness and order. A junior engineer, riding home during the final fitting-out phase, noted that the complexity of the new air conditioning plant alone is enough to baffle a man. We have miles of ducting woven through the steel like the veins of a giant, all to ensure a passenger can sleep in a cool room while we sweat in the heat of the North Atlantic summer. This hidden world of brass and steam was the heartbeat of the legend, a technical triumph that would eventually allow the ship to outlive almost all of her contemporaries. The secret race against competing nations was not fought with the aggressive pursuit of the blue ribbon, but with a quiet, calculated war of refinement. In the late 1950s, the North Atlantic was a crowded battlefield where the titans of Britain, France, and America vied for the soul of the modern traveler. While the SS United States relied on her staggering, secretive speed to lure passengers, and the aging queens of the Cunard Line relied on their Edwardian grandeur, the Holland America Line realized that the future belonged to the middle-class traveler seeking something more attainable, a sense of home at sea. The rivalry was geopolitical in nature, as the Dutch merchant fleet sought to prove that a smaller nation could out-engineer and out-design the great empires of the world. This competition necessitated a ship that did not just move people across the water, but served as a mobile statement of national prestige, a vessel that could compete with the looming threat of the de Havilland Comet and the Boeing 707 by offering an experience the sky could never replicate. The Dutch strategy was one of elegant service, a philosophy that prioritized the tactile and sensory over the purely technical. While the French line was preparing the SS France to be a long, lean symbol of Gallic pride, the designers of the Rotterdam focused on creating a ship that felt sturdier and more approachable. The rivalry extended even to the shipyard, where Dutch engineers analyzed the vibration issues of the British liners and the draft constraints of the American ones. They aimed to create a ship with a shallower draft that could enter ports the larger giants could not, a critical advantage for the burgeoning world cruise market. This tactical flexibility was the secret weapon of the Holland America Line. They were not just building a ferry for the Atlantic, but a versatile predator of the seas that could pivot to the Caribbean or the Mediterranean as the seasons shifted. Reports from the New York Times in 1958 captured this mounting tension, noting that the arrival of the new Dutch flagship is anticipated not for the record she might break, but for the standards of comfort she will undoubtedly set. The maritime press of the era often compared the construction of the Rotterdam to a game of high-stakes chess, where every design choice was a move against the prestige of the United Kingdom and France. A passenger advocate of the time wrote in a leading maritime journal, "The traveler is no longer a captive of the fastest hull, they are now a guest of the most hospitable one, and in this, the Dutch are proving to be formidable opponents." This shift in focus from the engine room to the dining room was a direct response to the changing demographics of the 1950s, where nostalgia for the old world began to blend with the optimism of the space age. The atmosphere on the docks of Rotterdam during this period was electric with its competitive spirit. Every time a new specification for the SS France was leaked, or a speed trial for the United States was publicized, the Dutch craftsmen redoubled their efforts to ensure their Grande Dame would be peerless in her finishing. There was a palpable sense of pride in the fact that their ship would be the first major liner designed from the keel up with a completely revolutionary funnel-less silhouette, a bold visual checkmate to the traditional designs of their rivals. This was more than just a business venture, it was a matter of national identity. As the hull grew, so did the realization that the Rotterdam would not just be a participant in the great Atlantic race, but perhaps the last and most refined expression of the era before the jet engine changed the world forever. The hidden innovations in the engine room were the true architect of the ship's legendary longevity, ensuring she remained a viable marvel long after her rivals had been sold for scrap. While the public marveled at the absence of funnels, the engineers at the Rotterdamse Maatschappij were focused on a more subtle revolution, the integration of a massive, ship-wide air conditioning system. At the time of her construction, the SS Rotterdam was one of the first large liners to be fully climate-controlled from bow to stern, a technical feat that required miles of insulated copper piping and high-capacity centrifugal compressors. This system allowed the ship to maintain a constant, spring-like temperature of 72 degrees, whether she was battling a frozen gale off the Grand Banks or steaming through the humid doldrums of the equator. To house this complex machinery without sacrificing passenger space, the designers utilized every square inch of the lower decks, weaving the veins of the ship through the steel bulkheads with the precision of a watchmaker. Equally secretive and vital was the design of the double helix staircase, a structural innovation inspired by the Renaissance architecture of the Château de Chambord. Because the ship was designed with a dual-class system for transatlantic crossings and a single-class system for cruising, the internal layout had to be a masterpiece of logistical flexibility. The staircase consisted of two separate, intertwined spirals that allowed first-class and tourist-class passengers to occupy the same physical space in the center of the ship without ever crossing paths. This was achieved through a complex arrangement of sliding mahogany panels and mirrored partitions that could be adjusted by the crew in a matter of minutes. From a technical standpoint, this required the ship's superstructure to be reinforced with additional longitudinal beams to support the massive open well of the staircase, a design that challenged the conventional wisdom of maritime hull rigidity. The ship's log during the final sea trials in 1959 captured the quiet confidence of the engineering team as they pushed the Schroeder Parsons turbines to their limits. One entry noted, the vessel achieves 20 knots with such lack of vibration that a coin can be stood on its edge upon the turbine casing without falling. This extraordinary stability was the result of a secret tuning process where the propeller shafts were balanced using experimental methods usually reserved for high-performance naval destroyers. A shipyard inspector wrote in his final report, "The Rotterdam does not merely move through the water, she glides over it, a testament to the new standards of hull form refinement we have pioneered here in the Netherlands." These trials proved that the aft engine configuration was not just a stylistic whim, but a superior method of power delivery that reduced stress on the hull and noise in the passenger quarters. As the final coats of Hal Gray paint were applied to the hull, the atmosphere in the shipyard shifted from the frantic energy of construction to the solemnity of a job well done. The workers, many of whom had spent their entire careers at the RDM, knew they had built something that transcended the typical merchant vessel. The smell of fresh varnish and heavy industrial grease mingled in the air as the last of the mahogany trim was polished to a high sheen. A lead carpenter, recording the moment in his personal diary, remarked, "There is a spirit in the wood and the steel of this girl. She feels as though she was grown rather than built, every joint and weld a silent promise to the sea." This internal perfection, hidden away from the prying eyes of international competitors, ensured that when the Rotterdam finally met the public, she would do so as the most technically advanced and refined ocean liner of her generation. The tension of the first high-speed crossing in September 1959 was masked by a veil of flawless Dutch hospitality and the rhythmic pulse of the Atlantic. As the SS Rotterdam slipped her moorings at the Wilhelminakade, the air was thick with the scent of celebratory gunpowder from the departure cannons and the heavy, sweet aroma of thousands of floral arrangements lining the corridors. On the bridge, Captain Konrad Bouwman maintained a stoic expression, but his eyes were fixed on the vibration monitors. This was the moment of truth for the aft engine design and the radical, funnel-less silhouette. Thousands of spectators lined the banks of the Maas, waving orange banners as the whispering ship glided toward the North Sea with an eerie, modern silence. The ship carried a cargo of expectation and national pride, with Crown Princess Beatrix herself gracing the passenger list, signaling that this was not merely a commercial crossing, but a state event on a floating sovereign territory. As the vessel reached the open ocean and increased her speed to 21 knots, the true engineering triumph became apparent to those on board. Unlike traditional liners that shuddered as they fought the swell, the Rotterdam seemed to slice through the waves with a predatory grace. The displacement of 38,000 tons felt weightless as the Denny Brown stabilizers engaged, countering the Atlantic's initial attempts to roll the hull. In the dining saloon, the crystal chandeliers remained perfectly still, and the soup in the fine china bowls did not ripple, a phenomenon that stunned veteran travelers accustomed to the violent shiver of the Great Queens. The technical staff monitored the fuel consumption of the Schroeder Parsons turbines, noting that the aerodynamic profile was providing an efficiency rating that exceeded their most optimistic shipyard projections. The New York Times tracked the progress of the voyage with keen interest, and telegrams flowed steadily between the bridge and the Holland America Line headquarters. One message from the ship's radio room read, "Vessel performing beyond all specifications, passenger comfort levels unprecedented in heavy weather." A passenger, writing in her diary on the third night at sea, noted the surreal atmosphere of the ship's interiors. "We are moving through a gale, yet in the Ritz-Carlton room, the only sound is the soft clink of silver and the low hum of the air conditioning. It feels as if we are in a palace that just happens to be moving toward America." This sense of detachment from the elements was exactly what the Dutch designers had intended. They had successfully commodified the ocean crossing, turning a hazardous journey into a seamless transition of luxury. As the skyline of New York finally emerged from the morning mist on September 11th, the atmosphere on the promenade decks reached a fever pitch. The tugboats of New York Harbor greeted the Rotterdam with towering plumes of water, their whistles creating a discordant symphony of welcome. The Grande Dame had arrived, not with the soot-stained exhaustion of a record breaker, but with the polished, effortless elegance of a victor. The maiden voyage had proven that the era of the floating cathedral was far from over, even as the first jet contrails began to score the sky above. The success of this crossing solidified the ship's reputation as the premier choice for the discerning elite, a reputation built on the invisible secrets of her shipyard and the visible splendor of her Dutch soul. Chapter 6, Art Deco at Sea. Why the interiors felt like a dream rather than a boat was the result of a deliberate, high-stakes rejection of traditional maritime aesthetics. By the time the SS Rotterdam was being outfitted, the heavy, dark-timbered old-world style of the pre-war liners had begun to feel claustrophobic and archaic. The Dutch designers, led by the visionary Han van Tienhoven, pivoted instead toward a transitional mid-century modern elegance that retained the glamour of Art Deco while embracing the airy, light-filled optimism of the late 1950s. Every public room was treated as a distinct gallery, utilizing an unprecedented palette of materials: fused glass, textured bronze, hand-woven tapestries, and exotic hardwoods like palisander and teak. The lack of a central funnel casing allowed for a soaring, open-plan layout, most notably in the Ritz-Carlton room, where the ceiling height and lack of structural pillars created the illusion of a grand ballroom in a Parisian hotel. The smell of the ship was not of salt and engine grease, but of expensive beeswax polish, fine Moroccan leather, and the faint, crisp scent of ozone from the advanced climate control system. Technically, the interior design was an exercise in extreme weight management and fire safety, utilizing new synthetic materials that mimicked the warmth of wood without the inherent risk of combustion. The floating cathedral effect was achieved through a sophisticated lighting scheme that used thousands of hidden incandescent bulbs to wash the walls in a soft, golden glow, erasing the harsh corners of the steel bulkheads. Designers integrated aluminum and formica in ways that felt luxurious rather than industrial, cladding the elevator banks in brushed metal and the promenade ceilings in acoustic tiles that dampened the sound of footsteps. This attention to acoustics was vital. The ship was engineered to be the whispering ship, where the roar of the North Atlantic was reduced to a distant, soothing hum. The furniture was not bolted to the floor in the traditional manner. Instead, much of it was weighted and balanced to remain stationary, giving the lounges a residential, unhurried atmosphere that invited passengers to linger. In letters to his colleagues, interior architect Han van Tienhoven described his artistic vision as a symphony of space where the horizon is invited indoors. He wrote that he wanted passengers to forget they were encased in a steel hull and instead feel as though they were suspended in a dream of light and color. This philosophy was manifested in the ship's extensive art collection, which featured over 2,000 original works by contemporary Dutch artists. A passenger from the inaugural season noted in a letter home that the Ambassador Lounge feels less like a room on a ship and more like a floating glass palace. One looks through the massive windows and sees the gray Atlantic, but inside, everything is warmth, silver, and the most delicate silk. This jarring contrast between the hostile environment outside and the curated perfection inside was the hallmark of the Rotterdam's aesthetic triumph. The sensory experience of the Grande Dame was further elevated by the tactile richness of the first-class suites, where the walls were lined with padded fabrics and the floors covered in deep pile-wool carpets from Deventer. Even the door handles and light switches were custom designed to feel substantial and smooth in the hand, reinforcing the sense of bespoke craftsmanship. As the sun set over the ocean, the transition from day to night was managed by the crew through the gradual dimming of the main lights and the activation of small, intimate table lamps, casting long, cinematic shadows across the Art Deco murals. It was a world of curated tranquility, a dreamscape built of steel and glass that stood in defiance of the chaotic world. Yet, as beautiful as these spaces were, they were also the stage for a complex social dance, one that relied on an invisible architecture of class and service. Chapter 7: The Social Machinery. The invisible wall between luxury and steerage was not a barrier of iron, but a masterpiece of psychological and architectural sleight of hand. On the SS Rotterdam, the traditional vertical separation of classes, where the wealthy occupied the top decks and the less affluent were relegated to the lower hull, was replaced by a revolutionary horizontal secret layout. This design allowed the ship to operate as a two-class vessel on Atlantic crossings and a single-class club during luxury cruises without major structural renovation. The social machinery relied on a dual-corridor system and the ingenious double-helix staircase, which allowed first-class and tourist-class passengers to move through the same central axis of the ship without ever making eye contact. To the first-class passenger, the ship felt like an exclusive private yacht. To the tourist-class passenger, the vessel felt like a modern, democratic marvel. This segregation was maintained by a silent army of stewards who adjusted sliding mahogany panels and velvet curtains in the dead of night, physically altering the ship's geography to expand or contract the boundaries of privilege based on the passenger manifest. From a technical perspective, this social engineering required a redundancy of services that was an engineering marvel in its own right. The Rotterdam featured two separate sets of grand public rooms, two main dining rooms, two theaters, and two libraries, each designed with the same high-end materials to ensure that tourist class did not feel like a second-rate experience. However, the engineering of the galley and service lanes was where the true complexity lay. A massive central spine of service elevators and crew stairwells ran through the core of the ship, allowing white-gloved waiters to emerge into the first-class Ritz-Carlton room with caviar while simultaneously serving hearty Dutch stews in the La Fontaine dining room below. The acoustics were so finely tuned that the boisterous laughter from a tourist-class cocktail party would never drift upward to disturb the hushed, library-like atmosphere of the first-class promenade, a feat achieved through the use of lead-lined bulkheads and thick, sound-absorbing wool tapestries. A first-class passenger, recording her observations in a leather-bound diary during a 1961 crossing, noted the peculiar efficiency of this social divide. One knows the other class is there, somewhere behind the beautiful rosewood doors, yet the illusion of being alone on the ocean is never broken. The stewards move like ghosts, appearing only when a glass is empty, and the music from the lower lounge is but a faint, pleasant vibration beneath one's feet. In contrast, a young Dutch immigrant in tourist class wrote to his family about the miracle of the ship, where even the cheaper cabins featured individual climate controls and sleek, mid-century furniture that felt like a glimpse into a wealthy future. This duality was the engine of the ship's commercial success. It provided a high-status veneer for the elite while offering a dignified, aspirational experience for the middle class, all within the same 38,000 tons of steel. The cliffhanger of this social arrangement was the delicate balance required of the crew, who had to navigate these two worlds with different sets of etiquette and expectations. Every evening, as the ship's bell signaled the start of dinner, the social machinery shifted into high gear, with the captain moving between the two worlds to maintain the thin veneer of a unified Dutch community. The transition from one class to another was a choreographed performance, but it was a performance that relied on the ship's ability to remain perfectly stable in the unpredictable North Atlantic. As the passengers slept in their carefully segregated quarters, the logistics of feeding and caring for thousands of souls in the middle of a gale presented an even more daunting challenge for the men in the galleys. The impossible task of feeding thousands during a North Atlantic gale turned the SS Rotterdam into a high-stakes industrial operation hidden behind the scent of freshly baked brioche. While the passengers above adjusted their ties or smoothed their cocktail dresses, the world below the waterline was a frantic, synchronized theater of logistics. In the heart of the ship, the main galley spanned the entire width of the hull, serving as a massive culinary factory that never slept. To manage the violent pitching of the ocean, every piece of kitchen equipment was specialized. The massive soup kettles were gimbaled to remain level as the ship rolled, and the ranges featured high steel fiddles to prevent heavy copper pans from sliding across the deck. The floors were tiled with a specific non-slip abrasive grit, allowing cooks to balance trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres while the hull groaned under the impact of 20-foot swells. This was the digestive system of the Grande Dame, a complex network of dumbwaiters, cold storage lockers, and butcher shops that maintained the illusion of effortless luxury even in the middle of a force 10 storm. The technical requirements for provisioning a city at sea were staggering, demanding a level of precision that rivaled the navigation on the bridge. For a standard crossing, the Rotterdam carried over 20,000 pounds of fresh beef, 10,000 pounds of poultry, and nearly 30,000 eggs, all stored in specialized refrigerated holds that were monitored for humidity and temperature every hour. The ship's water distillation plant was equally critical, converting salt water into 500 tons of fresh water daily to supply the kitchens, the laundry, and the passenger staterooms. Waste management was another hidden engineering feat. The ship utilized a complex series of compactors and incinerators to process tons of refuse without ever allowing a hint of smoke or odor to reach the promenade decks. This entire city of Rotterdam was powered by a dedicated auxiliary electrical grid, ensuring that even if the main propulsion turbines were throttled back for safety, the ovens would remain hot and the chandeliers would stay lit. Menu cards from the 1960s revealed the sheer ambition of the Dutch culinary team, often listing dozens of courses ranging from Dover sole to Chateaubriand. A former sous chef, interviewed for the ship's archives, recalled the intensity of service during a particularly rough crossing in 1964. The ship was leaning so far to port that we had to hold the plates down with our thumbs until the moment they were placed on the tray. We served 600 dinners that night, and not a single soufflé fell. This professional pride was the glue that held the logistics together. A 1962 inventory report from the chief purser noted that the ship went through 3,000 bottles of champagne and 500 pounds of caviar in a single week, a testament to the insatiable appetite of the mid-century elite. Every lemon, every sprig of parsley, and every silver fork had to be accounted for and placed with surgical precision to ensure the social machinery never ground to a halt. The sensory experience of the galley was a cacophony of clanging metal, shouting in 3 different languages, and the intense heat of the massive oil-fired ovens. Yet, as soon as a steward stepped through the swinging rubber doors into the dining saloon, the chaos vanished, replaced by the cool, hushed atmosphere of a 5-star restaurant. The transition was absolute. The logistics were not merely about moving food, they were about maintaining a psychological sanctuary for the passengers, a place where the terrors of the deep were replaced by the comfort of a perfectly chilled martini. As the ship crested a massive wave and the engines momentarily roared with the lack of resistance, the diners above felt only a slight vibration in their silver spoons. However, the true test of the ship's mettle was not found in the dining room, but in the legendary figures who walked her halls, bringing with them a different kind of weight. The celebrities who shaped the ship's mythos arrived not as mere passengers, but as the living jewelry of the SS Rotterdam's public spaces. In the golden age of the 1960s, the Grande Dame became a magnet for the global elite, who preferred the ship's understated Dutch elegance to the more ostentatious displays of the French or British liners. From the smoky, late-night jazz sets of Dave Brubeck to the towering presence of Frank Sinatra, the ship's lounges were transformed into high society stages where the world's most famous faces mingled with the Dutch aristocracy. These icons did not just occupy the staterooms, they imprinted their personalities onto the very fabric of the vessel. The smell of expensive Cuban tobacco and French perfume would linger in the Ritz-Carlton room long after the last notes of the orchestra had faded. For the 60-year-old nostalgic traveler, the Rotterdam remains a time capsule of this mid-century glamour, a place where the ghosts of Hollywood royalty still seem to glide through the golden-lit corridors of the upper promenade. Technically, accommodating such high-profile guests required a sophisticated layer of security and service that was largely invisible to the average traveler. The Special Service Department managed the complex logistics of celebrity arrivals, which often involved secret boarding procedures through the side shell doors to avoid the paparazzi on the pier. The ship's internal communication system, a marvel of 1950s telephony, allowed for private, encrypted lines to be run to the luxury suites, ensuring that a titan of industry could manage a global empire from the middle of the Atlantic. The suites themselves were masterpieces of engineering and design, featuring reinforced soundproofing and bespoke furniture that could withstand the ship's motion while providing the comfort of a Fifth Avenue penthouse. These spaces were the ultimate test of the ship's stability. The famous guests demanded a motionless experience, and the bridge officers worked tirelessly with the Denny Brown stabilizers to ensure that even a diva's glass of champagne remained perfectly still. The ship's guest book and archives are a treasure trove of these elite encounters, featuring the elegant signatures of royalty, politicians, and artists. One entry from a prominent American socialite in 1965 reads, "There is a certain hui salute or hominess to the Rotterdam that one cannot find on the more aggressive liners. Here, one is not just a passenger, but a guest of the Netherlands." This sentiment was echoed in the publicity photos of the era, which often showed stars like Audrey Hepburn leaning against the teak railings, the wind caught in her hair but her expression one of total serenity. A steward, writing in his memoirs, recalled the night Prince Rainier and Princess Grace of Monaco dined in the club room. The entire ship seemed to vibrate with a different energy, the crew moved with even more precision, and the lighting seemed to glow a bit brighter just to match the princess's smile. This era of celebrity helped craft the ship's enduring mythos as a floating palace of the arts, a reputation that was reinforced by the museum-quality works that adorned the walls. Yet, behind the glamour and the flashing bulbs, the ship remained a machine built for the harshest environment on Earth. The famous faces were shielded from the reality of the North Atlantic by the ship's still skin and the crew's expertise, but the ocean was a constant, brooding presence. The transition from the hushed, star-studded lounges to the salt-sprayed reality of the bridge was a jarring reminder of the ship's true purpose. As the Grande Dame carried her famous cargo through the dark, the weather began to shift, leading toward a night where the celebrity guests would find themselves face to face with the raw power of the sea. The night the ocean almost won began not with a roar, but with a deceptive, low-frequency shudder that bypassed the ship's stabilizers and vibrated directly into the marrow of the passengers' bones. It was mid-November, the season when the North Atlantic transforms into a graveyard of ambition, and the SS Rotterdam found herself squarely in the path of a rapidly intensifying bomb cyclone. As the barometer plummeted, the wind transitioned from a rhythmic whistle to a sustained, demonic scream that tore the crests off 60-foot waves, turning the air into a blinding slurry of salt spray and freezing rain. On the bridge, the officer of the watch gripped the brass railing as the ship's bow plummeted into a cavernous trough, followed by a bone-jarring impact that sent a shudder through all 700 feet of her steel frame. The whispering ship was suddenly forced to scream back at the elements, her turbines groaning as the propellers momentarily cleared the water before plunging back into the churning abyss. Technically, this was the ultimate validation of the RDM shipyard's structural philosophy, as the aft engine configuration provided a unique advantage in such extreme conditions. With the heaviest machinery located further back, the boat possessed a natural buoyancy that allowed it to rise more quickly out of the green water that threatened to crush the forward deckhouses. However, the immense leverage of the storm placed unimaginable stress on the hull's longitudinal stringers. The ship's rivets and welds were subjected to millions of pounds of torque as she twisted between the peaks of two waves. Below decks, the engineering crew worked in a fever dream of heat and motion, manually adjusting the steam valves to prevent the turbines from overspeeding every time the stern lifted. The Denny Brown stabilizers, usually so effective, had to be retracted to prevent them from being sheared off by the lateral force of the surging currents, leaving the Grande Dame to fight the Atlantic with nothing but her weight and her breathing. A specific logbook entry from a winter crossing in the mid-1960s captures the chilling reality of the command chair during such a tempest. The captain wrote, "Visibility 0. Vessel taking heavy spray over the bridge windows. The pitching is severe, yet the hull remains tight, no weeping of the rivets reported in the forward holds. We have reduced speed to 5 knots to ease the pounding, praying the steering gear holds against the following sea. This was the silent burden of the crew, maintaining a calm exterior for the passengers while staring into an obsidian night where the horizon had vanished. In the first-class cabins, the sound of the storm was a muffled, rhythmic thudding, but in the pantry, the crash of breaking porcelain served as a violent reminder of the ocean's proximity. A passenger, reflecting years later, remembered the smell of the storm, a sharp, metallic scent of ozone and wet iron that managed to seep past the heavy brass seals of the portholes. The sensory experience of the storm was most visceral in the grand lounges, where the massive windows of the upper promenade offered a terrifying front-row seat to the destruction. As the ship rolled to 25 degrees, the heavy velvet curtains swung like pendulums, and the distant, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the hull plates flexing provided a haunting soundtrack to the night. It was a moment of profound vulnerability that stripped away the veneer of celebrity and class, leaving only the raw human instinct to survive. Yet, the Rotterdam did more than survive, she triumphed. By dawn, as the gray, exhausted light revealed a sea of white foam, the ship emerged with her masts intact and her spirit unbroken. This victory over the elements set the stage for her most daring performance, a final, desperate push to prove that steam and steel could still outrun the future. Pushing the turbines to the breaking point was never the official mission of the SS Rotterdam, yet there were moments when the schedule demanded a flirtation with the limits of physics. In the summer of 1968, a significant delay in the English Channel due to dense fog left the ship nearly 12 hours behind its scheduled arrival at the Ambrose Light. For the Holland America Line, punctuality was as much a part of the brand as the impeccable service. To arrive late was to admit defeat to the burgeoning airline industry. The order was relayed from the bridge to the chief engineer, bring the Schutter Parsons turbines to their maximum continuous rating. As the telegraph handle moved to full ahead, a new vibration, a high-frequency hum, began to resonate through the aft section of the ship. The smell of the engine room changed, becoming more metallic and sharp as the steam pressure in the boilers climbed to their red line limits. The whispering ship began to roar, her twin propellers turning the Atlantic into a mountainous wake of white foam that stretched for miles toward the horizon. Technically, the feat of maintaining 25 knots in a ship designed for 21 required a masterful orchestration of the boiler rooms. The engineers had to carefully monitor the temperature of the turbine bearings, which were now spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, generating heat that challenged the capacity of the oil cooling systems. This was the raw power of steam in its final, most refined form. The double reduction gearing hummed like a jet engine as it translated the energy of superheated vapor into the torque needed to move 38,000 tons of steel at record speeds. The ship's aerodynamic profile, designed without the drag of traditional funnels, finally paid dividends. The air flowed smoothly over the sleek superstructure, while the clipper-like bow sliced through the swells with such force that the spray reached the bridge windows, 50 feet above the waterline. The fuel consumption was staggering, but for these few hours, the economics of the voyage were sacrificed to the altar of maritime prestige. An engineer's report from that record-paced leg noted the intense atmosphere beneath the waterline. The heat in the lower flats was almost unbearable, reaching over 110 degrees near the high-pressure casing. Every man on watch was focused on the gauges. A single burst pipe at this pressure would have been catastrophic. We felt the ship straining, not out of fatigue, but out of a sudden, violent realization of her own strength. This hidden drama was felt by the passengers as a subtle, invigorating tension. A passenger in the dining saloon wrote that the silver on the tables rattled with a feverish excitement, and the horizon seemed to blur as the ship chased the sun toward the west. It was a display of Dutch engineering that silenced the critics who claimed the aft engine design lacked the guts of the older transatlantic thoroughbreds. The cliffhanger of this high-speed dash was the realization that even at her fastest, the Rotterdam was racing against a clock she could never truly beat. As the ship successfully reached New York just minutes before her scheduled docking, the victory felt hollow. In the sky above, the vapor trails of the first commercial jets were a reminder that the world had grown smaller, and speed was no longer a luxury, it was a commodity. The turbines were throttled back, and the engine room returned to its quiet, orderly hum, but the stress of the run had left its mark. The Grande Dame had proven she could run with the best of them, but the era of the high-speed crossing was ending, and a new, darker shadow was beginning to fall over the Atlantic. The day the luxury ended and the camouflage of the 1970s began was marked by a quiet, bureaucratic shift that fundamentally altered the ship's soul. By 1971, the writing was on the wall. The transatlantic ferry service was no longer a profitable venture for a vessel of the Rotterdam's magnitude. The world was changing, and the Grande Dame was forced to shed her dual identity to become a full-time cruise ship. This transition required more than just a change in itinerary. It necessitated the physical removal of the invisible walls that had defined her social machinery for over a decade. The mahogany partitions that separated the classes were folded back permanently, and the double helix staircase, once a masterpiece of segregation, became a unified thoroughfare for a new, more casual breed of traveler. The smell of the ship shifted from the formal, waxen leather scent of the 1950s to something more tropical, suntan lotion, pineapple, and the salt air of the Caribbean. The ship was no longer a bridge between continents. She was a destination in herself, a floating island of leisure navigating a world of increasing geopolitical instability. Technically, the conversion to full-time cruising presented a new set of engineering headaches for the crew. The ship had been designed for the cold, deep waters of the North Atlantic, and her cooling systems struggled to keep pace with the humid, shallow waters of the West Indies. The air conditioning compressors, once the pride of the RDM shipyard, were pushed to their limits to maintain the 72-degree sanctuary the passengers expected. To accommodate the longer stays in port, the ship's electrical systems had to be modified to handle the hotel load without the cooling effect of the ship's motion. Furthermore, the hull, painted in its signature How gray, began to absorb the intense Caribbean sun, requiring a more frequent and rigorous painting schedule to prevent the steel from buckling under the thermal stress. The graceful, clipper-like bow, once used to shatter Atlantic swells, now spent its days gently nudging the coral reefs of St. Thomas and Nassau. The Holland America Line board meeting minutes from 1971 reflect a profound sense of melancholy regarding this change. One director noted, "We are witnessing the end of a maritime tradition that spans centuries. The Rotterdam is now a pleasure ship, and while this ensures her survival, we must acknowledge that the dignity of the crossing has been lost to the convenience of the cruise." This sentiment was shared by the veteran crew members, who found the shift from formal service to the love boat era jarring. A head waiter wrote in a letter to his wife, "The passengers no longer wear dinner jackets, they want buffet lines and steel drums. The ship feels like she is wearing a costume that doesn't quite fit her." This cultural friction was the first sign that the age of the great liners was passing, as the ship became a relic of a time that the modern world was moving away from at the speed of sound. The sensory experience of the ship during this period was one of fading grandeur. The gold leaf in the Ritz-Carlton room began to dull under the constant exposure to tropical humidity, and the once exclusive libraries were repurposed for bingo games and duty-free shopping. Yet, the Rotterdam retained an undeniable gravity. She was still a massive, steam-powered cathedral in a sea of increasingly plastic-looking modern vessels. The cliffhanger for the Grande Dame was no longer the threat of a rogue wave, but the sound of the future roaring overhead. As the ship sat at anchor in the turquoise waters of the Caribbean, the shadow of a Boeing 747 would frequently pass over her sun decks, its engines a thunderous reminder that the ocean was no longer the only way to see the world. The jet age was not just a competitor, it was a predator, and the ship's very existence was about to be called into question. The sound in the sky that signaled the end for the sea was a low, persistent thrum that eventually drowned out the rhythmic splash of the bow wave. By the mid-1970s, the Boeing 747 had transformed the Atlantic from a majestic 6-day journey into an inconvenient 6-hour hurdle. For the SS Rotterdam, the threat was existential. The jumbo jet could carry nearly as many passengers as the ship's entire tourist class in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost. The sky was suddenly filled with aluminum birds that looked down upon the Grande Dame as a slow, steam-powered anachronism. This new reality forced a grim reassessment of the ship's engineering. The massive Schilder Parsons turbines, designed to push 38,000 tons of steel across the ocean at high speed, were now symbols of a vanishing economy. While a jet engine burned fuel with surgical efficiency to reach the upper atmosphere, the ship's boilers required constant, expensive feeding to merely maintain a cruising speed. The smell of the air was no longer just the salt of the sea, but the sharp, acrid scent of kerosene drifting down from the clouds. Technically, the ship was now fighting a war of attrition against the clock and the balance sheet. Every hour spent at sea was an hour of labor, food, and fuel that the airlines simply did not have to account for. The Rotterdam's complex steam plant, which required a specialized crew of dozens to operate, became a liability compared to the automated efficiency of modern aviation. Maintenance on the aging hull became more difficult as the specialized shipyards of the post-war era began to close their doors, unable to compete with the rapid turnover of the aerospace industry. To survive, the ship had to be marketed as the anti-jet and appeal to the sensory experience of the journey rather than the utility of the arrival. The engineering focus shifted from speed to total comfort, with the crew obsessively maintaining the stabilizers and the air conditioning to ensure that the ship remained a peaceful sanctuary that the vibrating, cramped cabins of a 747 could never provide. Newspaper editorials of the time lamented the slow way to Europe, often framing the Rotterdam as a beautiful but dying species. One writer for a prominent travel magazine noted in 1975, "To board the Rotterdam now is to enter a time machine. It is an act of rebellion against the frantic, plastic world of the airport terminal." But one wonders how much longer the Dutch can afford such a magnificent rebellion. This melancholy was palpable on the ship's bridge, where officers watched the vapor trails overhead with a mixture of professional respect and personal grief. A passenger diary from a late 70s cruise captured the mood. "The deck is nearly empty as we pass under the path of the evening flight to London." Everyone looked up at the tiny silver speck in the sky, and for a moment, the music in the lounge seemed to falter. We are the ones left behind, and we are loving every slow, silent minute of it. The sensory experience of this period was defined by a haunting quiet. The ship often sailed with fewer passengers than in her prime, leaving the vast Art Deco halls feeling like the galleries of a silent museum. The vibration of the engines felt more like a heartbeat than a machine, a steady pulse in a world that had moved on to the high-pitched whine of the turbine. The cliffhanger for the Grande Dame was no longer whether she could beat the clock, but whether she could survive the cold reality of the ledger. As the 1980s approached, the threat of the jet age was joined by a new generation of purpose-built cruise ships that lacked her soul but possessed a ruthless efficiency. The end of the Dutch era was approaching, leading to a final crossing that would break the hearts of a nation. The emotional goodbye of the last crew in September 1997 was a vigil held in the shadow of a departing era. As the SS Rotterdam prepared to leave her namesake city for what many feared would be the final time, the atmosphere on the Wilhelmina Kade was thick with a heavy, maritime grief. For nearly 40 years, the ship had been the moving heartbeat of the Netherlands, a steel ambassador that had carried the hopes of a recovering nation across the world. Now, she was being sold to Premier Cruises, her hull to be repainted and her name changed to the Rembrandt. On that final day, the air was filled with the discordant wail of hundreds of ship whistles from every tug and freighter in the harbor, a cacophony of respect for the Grande Dame. The smell of the morning was a mixture of rain, diesel smoke, and the thousands of bouquets of flowers tossed into the water by a weeping crowd. On the bridge, the officers stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the horizon as they prepared to hand over the keys to a ship that felt more like a family member than a machine. Technically, the final crossing under the Holland America banner was a bittersweet testament to the ship's endurance. Despite the decades of service, her Parsons turbines still hummed with the same precision they had possessed during her maiden voyage in 1959. The engineering team performed the final, meticulous blowdown of the boilers, ensuring the steam plant was in peak condition for the new owners, even as they felt the pang of turning over such a temperamental and sophisticated system to strangers. The hull remained remarkably tight, a tribute to the Dutch shipbuilders who had riveted and welded her with such care during the post-war reconstruction. However, the modern world was closing in. The ship lacked the computerized stabilizers and fuel-efficient diesel-electric pods of the new mega-ships, making her a living fossil in an industry that valued overhead and efficiency above all else. This technical obsolescence was the true tragedy. She was a masterpiece of a medium that was no longer being painted. A personal account from one of the last Dutch crew members, a head steward who had served on the ship for 30 years, captured the intimate scale of the loss. "I walked through the Ritz-Carlton room one last time at 3 a.m. The moonlight was hitting the fused glass murals, and the ship gave a small, familiar groan as she settled into a swell. It felt as though the ship herself knew the Dutch flag was coming down. I touched the mahogany railing and whispered "Bedankt, thank you." This sentiment was shared by the passengers on that final voyage, many of whom had booked their cabins years in advance to witness the end of an era. The guest books were filled with messages of gratitude, written in shaky, elderly hands, thanking the ship for being a sanctuary of elegance in an increasingly loud and hurried world. The final dinner was served with the usual precision, but the clink of silver felt muted, as if the diners were attending a state funeral. The sensory experience of the final hours was defined by a haunting sense of the last time. The last time the Dutch ensign would be raised at dawn, the last time the chimes would announce dinner in the La Fontaine room, the last time the whispering ship would call Rotterdam home. As the vessel cleared the English Channel and turned toward the open Atlantic, a heavy fog descended, wrapping the Grande Dame in a gray, silent shroud. It was a fitting departure for a ghost of the steam age. But the story of the SS Rotterdam was not destined to end in a breaker's yard in India or a watery grave. Behind the scenes, a grassroots movement was forming, a desperate and unlikely plan to bring the Queen back to her throne. The legacy of the ship was about to transition from a memory into a monument. Why these steel ghosts still haunt our modern world is because they represent a height of craftsmanship and communal grace that the digital age has struggled to replicate. The SS Rotterdam did not vanish into the obscurity of a scrap heap. Instead, she became the centerpiece of one of the most ambitious maritime preservation projects in history. After years of uncertainty under various flags and names, and a period of quiet decay in a tropical port, the Save the Steamship Rotterdam Foundation turned a national dream into a reality. In 2008, the Grande Dame returned to her home city, towed through the same water she had first mastered 50 years prior. The sight was transcendent. Nearly 100,000 people lined the banks of the Maas River, their cheers competing with the deep, resonant boom of the ship's own whistle. The smell of the homecoming was one of wet pavement, celebratory flares, and the unmistakable, iron-heavy scent of the ship herself, returning to the mud and the memories that had birthed her. Technically, the restoration of the vessel into a permanent hotel and museum was a monumental engineering challenge that required stripping away decades of hazardous materials while preserving the delicate mid-century modern interiors. The ship's original Schutte Parsons turbines were cleaned and preserved as static displays, allowing visitors to walk through the once restricted engine rooms and witness the scale of the machinery that had powered the Dutch merchant marine. The double helix staircase was restored to its former glory, its rosewood handrails polished to a mirror shine once more. However, the ship is no longer a living machine. Her boilers are cold, and her propellers are still. She is now a dead ship in technical terms, yet she possesses more vitality than many modern vessels. The integration of modern safety systems, fire suppression, and shore power electrical grids was woven into the 1950s steel with such care that the transition between the old and the new was virtually invisible to the eye of the guest. The legacy of the ship is best expressed in the words of the people who now walk her decks as tourists rather than travelers. A quote from one of the preservationists during the 2008 homecoming captured the essence of her survival. "We didn't just save 38,000 tons of steel, we saved a piece of the Dutch soul." This ship is a reminder that even in a world of high-speed jets and instant communication, there is still a deep, human need for the slow, the beautiful, and the permanent. This sentiment is echoed by the thousands of visitors who stay in her original cabins each year, finding a strange comfort in the heavy brass portholes and the gentle, almost imperceptible sway of the hull and the river current. The ship has become a living bridge between the 60-year-old nostalgic and the young design enthusiast, proving that true elegance is never truly obsolete. The sensory experience of the SS Rotterdam today is a curated walk through a dream of the past. The golden glow of the Ritz-Carlton room still feels like a sanctuary, and the sound of the wind whistling through the twin stovepipe funnels still carries the echoes of the North Atlantic. She stands as a sentinel at the Wilhelminakade, a reminder of an era when we didn't just move across the world, but experienced it with every sense. As the sun sets behind the modern skyscrapers of Rotterdam, the Grande Dame casts a long, elegant shadow across the water, a steel ghost that refuses to fade. She remains the last of her kind, a floating cathedral that survived the storms of the ocean and the winds of time to tell us who we once were and what we are capable of building.